Penises. So many penises. Bet that's not the way you expected this video to start, did you? Well, here we are. And no, this is not a video about penis. This video is already, like, book reviews already struggle to get views. This one's just, it's gonna be gone, ain't it? Well, screw it. In for a penny, in for a pound. We're gonna be talking about a lot of, I'll be real, just fucked up subject matter in this video because of the book I'm discussing, which isn't like a bad thing, so to speak. But anyway, what's shaking, booktube? My name's Cam and welcome back to another video. Sorry, wait, what was that? You hate love triangles? Me too. In fact, I have a shirt that even says that. What a coinky dink. Maybe a bit tricky to see because of the neon design, but this is my We Hate Love Triangles shirt. Find it at the Wolf Shot Shop, link in description. Today I will be reviewing this monster. I don't mean monster because it's a bad book, although I'll get to that. I mean monster because, holy hell, I like them big. I like them chunky. Dead meme. Check this out. Ready? This book is called Black Leopard Red Wolf by Marlon James. This was a massively, and I mean massively, hyped fantasy book, high fantasy, epic fantasy if you like, advertised as being an African Game of Thrones, an African Lord of the Rings, and basically thrown into the ring to be a contender for the next major, influential, and important fantasy fiction story. And if that sounds awesome, it's because that's a pretty fucking awesome way to describe a book. In fact, if you remember my TBR video, you might remember me saying this. As you just heard, the synopsis sounds extremely interesting. But the one thing that really put this on my anticipated releases list was that it says drawing from African history and mythology, because, again, referring to my past writing, mythology and legends, or just mythos in general, is super interesting to me. Well, it's interesting to a lot of people, but I have a particular interest in it. While this video won't contain any spoilers for the story, here is a spoiler for the video itself. I don't think it was any of those things. I don't think it was an African Game of Thrones. I don't think it was an African Lord of the Rings. I don't think it was even close to being a contender for the next important fantasy fiction. Let me tell you why, and I'm going to go through the good and the bad of this book, because there is quite a lot of both, and both sides have some pretty strong points. A lot of people, when reviewing this book, have said that it is extremely difficult to summarize their feelings on this, and I get that. I understand. When I sat down to write my review for this, it looked a whole lot different to how it's going to sound now, and that's because my initial view on this was, I don't know, maybe it's just me, maybe this isn't to my personal taste. But then I honestly asked myself, am I treating my review of this book the same way I would any other book? And I said no, and the reason I wasn't treating it the same way to begin with is entirely because I was so ready for a fantasy story that would break the mold. That's what I was told this was, that's what I've seen other reviews boasting about this book, that's what I've been hoping for a very long time. Let's get into some of the pros of this book, because although I have a pretty low opinion of the story itself and my experience reading this, Marlon James is obviously very, very talented and has a lot of skills as a writer. Marlon has an instantly recognizable style and tone with his writing. He has a very articulated way of describing elements and locations and settings within his stories that just is phenomenal. It works for him in the best way it possibly could. The way Marlon is able to set a scene and describe action, but specifically set a scene and the environment, is one of the things that gave me the ability to read this book until the end. And that's very important with a fantasy story, especially like an epic fantasy, is you need to be taken through this fictional world and be put in an immersive way into all of these environments. And Marlon is probably one of the best people I've read do that in years. And I mean years and years. He is exceptionally talented when it comes to setting a fantasy scene. It's remarkable, really. It's nothing less than that. He also has a really, really good way of writing a fast-paced action scene. He knows exactly when to make the switches from his sometimes kind of monotonous, long-winded descriptions into a fast-paced action scene. The transitions, I will say, are always very well done. Very, very well done. Specifically transitions from slow-paced to fast-paced. It's important I specify which transitions I'm referring to there. Another pro within, Black Leopard Red Wolf is a bit of a tricky one because it's also part of the cons, and that's the characters and the way he writes the characters. While, for the most part, I feel the characters weren't written all that well, the ones that were written well were written really, really, really fucking well, and it's a bit disappointing that same kind of... I was going to say same level of attention, but that's not the problem with the characters that are, in my opinion, written badly. It's more so that I feel in some points he overestimated or underestimated just how much he should be telling us about a character. But the ones he did well, he did really, really well. There were certain characters within the story that were seriously engaging. For example, there's a character who is kind of reminds me of a Hagrid or Hodor, especially. Basically a character called Sadogo, or Sadogo, however you want to pronounce it. And he is part of a race called the Ogo, which is giants, basically. And got his name pretty much the same way Hodor did, although that's all I'll say on that, because it's spoiler-free. I can tell you, though, that the backstory to Sadogo was one of my absolute favourite bits of the story, and that's one of the best, most exceptionally well-told backstories I've read in a fantasy story in such a long time. I also really liked certain standouts, which you'll probably only know about if you've already read the book, but I'll mention them anyway. The mass possession scene, the chase scene with, I forget what the creatures are called, but they're basically demons, and they're on horses, and they're being chased by the little impish demons. And it's stuff like these, and it's the prose like these, that are the reason my disappointment is so passionate when it comes to this story. It's a massive letdown when I read these parts of the story that are done so well, and it's just not consistent throughout, and it's such a, wasted opportunity, I feel. Unfortunately, it's just a situation where, personally, I feel the pros are very few, and the cons, there's a lot of them. But the thing is, the pros are all so strong that it almost levels it out, but not quite. So yeah, I have a lot of issues with this book. The first one, I want to say, isn't directly Marlin's fault, and that is that the marketing for Black Leopard Red Wolf was terrible. It was garbage. I'm really not happy with the way this book was marketed in certain aspects. I mean, it was very effective and very successful in marketing the book, in that it built up a lot of hype and got the book out there into pretty much every inch of the fantasy reading community. But the problem is the way it was marketed. It was marketed as, like I said before, an African Lord of the Rings or an African Game of Thrones, and it's just not those things. It's barely comparable. Being a fan of those series in no way is going to prepare you for this series. There's obviously a few similarities in that they are all fantasy stories, but that's kind of where the similarities end. The general theme and tone and almost everything is just far apart. I want to add to the pros I mentioned before as well, the African mythology. That was one of the biggest drawing points for me reading this fantasy story, because most fantasy story is European culture, which isn't a problem, of course, but that's the fantasy trap that a lot of writers fall into. They don't do a lot of exploration outside of, European fantasy and mythology. They'll sometimes delve into, Asian or Eastern, but very rarely it goes to, African mythology, that kind of thing. I don't think I've ever read a book that involved a whole lot of African mythology, and that's why I was so excited for this one. But yeah, going back to the cons in terms of marketing, the problem is that this book, let me tell you right now, if you don't have a strong disposition towards dark themes and dark subject matter, you're not going to be able to read this book. You're just not going to be able to do it. There's no warning in the synopsis. There's no warning in the marketing for this book that it is anywhere close to being as dark as it really is. And I think that's pretty damn disappointing. I think the fact that most people would make it as far as paying the money for this massive book and reading, a fair bit into it before realizing that they've started a commitment to something that is well and truly out of their wheelhouse. The list of trigger warnings, if you want to call it that, for this book is immense. Almost every single touchy subject you can imagine is in this book. That's not a problem for me. That's fine. Books deal with uncomfortable subjects. I'm okay with that. I've actually done a whole big discussion video on why I feel problematic. The word problematic is thrown around way too often for book reviews, because books are meant to make you feel uncomfortable from time to time and deal with subjects that are just hard to read through. But it always needs to serve a purpose, and this is a massive problem I have with this book. And a lot of the reviews for this book, a lot of the positive reviews have said that, it deals a lot with things like rape and child molestation, and there is a lot of it. They say, it deals a lot with, and I don't even want to say it in this video because, screw it, this video is already probably not going to get suggested to a lot of people anyway, so whatever. There's a lot of rape and there's a lot of child molestation. That's just the facts of the matter. There is so much boy sex. And I say boy because that's the exact word used in the story for a lot of the characters that are, having sex and being molested. They're described as boys, and it's extremely uncomfortable. And again, that's okay if it serves a purpose, but despite what a lot of the reviews for this book would tell you, they say, it always serves a purpose. All of this dark subject matter, it always adds something to the story and serves a purpose. That is objectively false. That's an incorrect statement. And reviews are subjective, sure, but that statement that it always serves a purpose, I feel, is objectively false, is factually false, because it just isn't always the case. There are characters who exist for no more than one page, and our first introduction to them is them fucking some kid against a dresser or something. It's not necessary, and it's very often used as a device to show you that this character isn't that great of a person, rather than just showing that through dialogue. It has to be done by some really graphic explanation of rape, and that's just... There's a point where it stops being, bold and brave and edgy and just starts being completely unnecessary and irresponsible to the plot. I like to pride myself on what I feel is my ability to handle a book that deals with dark subject matter, but this book doesn't just dabble in things like, rape and graphic genitalia related stuff and molestation and mutilation and suicide and literally everything that could ever get a video flagged on YouTube. It doesn't just dabble in those things, it's saturated in those things. This book is drenched and dripping with those things, and it's just not necessary. Some of the parts in the story could have been so enjoyable if not ruined by these moments of just unnecessary edgy bullshit. I don't know what Marlin's intention was in adding so much of this stuff to this story. I can only assume that it was to try and make it super bold and, risk-taking, that kind of thing, but it's just... I don't think it's necessary anyway. That's all I'll say on the subject of dark themes within this book. You get what I'm saying. I'm gonna try and dot point some of the other cons I have with this book, because I could talk for literally an hour about the issues I have with this book. While I said before a lot of the pacing is a massive pro for this book, it can also be a massive con. The issue is that a lot of characters that we're led to believe are major characters come and go in the story just rapidly. They're introduced to us, right, and we get almost their entire life story, and then after a couple of pages they dip out, and we've wasted all this time investing in this character that was not even that important to the story whatsoever. After a couple of times it becomes super, super frustrating. Another big thing that would turn a lot of people off being able to read this story, and I feel probably should be mentioned in every review for this story so other readers know, is that it is immensely, and to be honest, in my opinion, needlessly vague and complex through a lot of the story. You have to really pay attention just to know what's going on in Black Leopard Red Wolf. So much of the dialogue is just vague, and although, like I said, Marlon James is an extremely talented writer, and I have no doubt that he's going to do fine in the writing world. My hope would just be that he would deviate a bit from the cons I'm mentioning, but he has this habit of, within dialogue, speaking in riddles, and that's kind of a thing with a lot of fantasies, but in this book it is just way too heavy. That, coupled with the general plot of the book, and most importantly, the random time jumps without any warning or any real indication that we're reading about a different time in the story, is very, very confusing and complex. You're gonna get a lot of people that'll be like, it wasn't confusing at all, actually. Fuck off. It was, for a lot of readers. Congratulations, you're very smart for not getting confused. I like to think I'm pretty good at keeping up with where a story is at, even if I'm half invested in it. But this one, I had to really pay attention. And again, that's not really a problem, but it needs to be for an important purpose, and this one I just feel was needlessly complex. There was a lot of points in the story in terms of time jumps where it felt like the actual plot that you read about on the back of the book is starting, but it's not actually. It actually reminds me of, you know, that episode of Family Guy where he's at the movies and all the movie studio logos are coming up on the screen before the movie starts, and he thinks the movie's starting, and then it goes into another studio logo. That's basically what this book was kind of like.
Oh, this guy's in trouble. Can't wait to hear his story. Oh, come on!
He would start what you think is the plot, and you're like, oh, yes! And then it jumps forward like 10, 20 years or whatever, and you're like, oh, okay, I guess we're going to start the story now, and then it time jumps again, and it's just frustrating. The next con really ties in with the last one, and that is that if you have a super complex plot or storyline, you need to have a really compelling motivation for the heroes. And there just isn't really. Correct me if I'm wrong if you've read this book, but I still don't entirely understand why the main hero really gave that much of a shit about the mission he was willing to die for. I don't know, the motivations just felt kind of weak at times, completely non-existent, that's all. Well, that's pretty much most of the cons in the shortest way I can possibly describe them. If I was to summarize it, I just think that the book is really just weighed down with so much needlessly complex and graphic and grotesque and hypersexualized content that's not necessary. And I hate even saying that because it makes me sound like I'm really conservative and I don't like sex and violence in books, but that's not true. It needs to serve a purpose, and it just didn't. I understand that this whole different approach that Marlin had to a fantasy story was meant to shake up the Western genre. It was meant to really break the mold. I get that, and I'm willing to accept that. But I don't think this book did that, and a lot of people are saying the reason people don't like it is because it's so different and it's a different way of storytelling. This isn't a new way of storytelling. By any means, a lot of people have done this. The reason that never became popular is because it's not a good way of doing it. So yeah, I'm just ultimately disappointed with this book. I'm a little bit disappointed I invested so much time in it, and I'm pretty disappointed that I'm going to have to keep waiting for another fantasy book that's going to really shake up the genre, and I hope with mythology that I haven't been exposed to before. Personally, I just don't think there was anything that new and especially groundbreaking about Black Leopard Red Wolf. Despite what I've been trying to tell myself, I just don't think it was a very good book. So yeah, this one gets 2 out of 5 censored penises. I can't really say I would recommend it, but if you want to give it a try, good luck. Hope you enjoyed the review, and if you loved this book, if you had a completely different opinion on it, whole different take on it, feel free to leave me a comment and tell me where you think I'm wrong. Just do it like a grown human being. Just don't come at me childish, or I'm just not gonna acknowledge it. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Catch ya.